Hello, and welcome to everyone that is tuning in. We're happy that you're here. This is the 15th episode of the JOS Jester Stories podcast. My voice should sound familiar to you, but in case you can't quite figure out who I am, it's Tabia, and I'll be your host for today. Now, at JOS, we like to have and share different types of conversations ranging from a variety of topics, and today we'll be having an important discussion about Palestine in the illegal occupation of Israel. To all our listeners, as always, we urge you to have open ears, an open mind, and an open heart. Joining me for today's episode are some new voices, all of whom I've had the pleasure of working with this year. They're all from Toriel Laurier Collegiate Institute, either as current students or as alumni. And so, without further ado, let us welcome our new voices. Abrar, you can start.
So hi everyone, Tabia, thank you for the lovely introduction. So my name is Abrar. I am in grade 12, well, not anymore. I'm an alumni of Laurier, just graduated. I have committed to Schulich School of Business over at York University. I've been the past MSA president of Laurier, which is a Muslim Student Association. And through that organization, I had the pleasure of working with everyone today. And honestly, it's just been really interesting to work with everyone. Everyone's really on the same page about this issue. And I'm just ready to get going and talk about this extremely important humanitarian issue. So, yeah.
My name's Faraaz. Um, I was also an alumni at Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and I was also a part of MSA as a senior communications officer. This fall, I'm going to be going to McMaster for level one engineering, and I'm glad I was invited because I find this topic to be very important, and it's something very close to a lot of us because we've gone through a lot to just even talk about this. So I'm glad we have this space to really talk about it.
Hi, everybody. My name is Salma Rabi. I'm going into grade 12 and I go to Laurier and I also work alongside everybody here in MSA as well.
Hey everyone, my name is Samir Sarwar. I'm in grade 9 going into grade 10. I was a junior communications officer for MSA, and it's good to have this space to speak openly about this issue. Whereas during the school year, when we tried to speak about this issue, we were extremely restricted. So having this open space where we can discuss how we truly feel about this is definitely really good, and we definitely plan to go quite in depth on it.
Thank you to all our new voices for introducing themselves. I'm so excited. All these folks I've worked with this entire year, and they're great. They're awesome. I love them all so much. So I'm very excited to get this conversation going. Just as a heads up to our listeners, so what we will be talking about is kind of what the history behind this entire issue and this entire situation between Palestine and Israel. Then we'll be going into what's happened recently, so what you may have seen on the news or on social media, and then we'll be going into how this has affected youth and what youth have done and what youth can do in terms of what's happening. So we'll start right away with the history. So, is there anyone here that wants to start us off? You can go ahead.
If it's no problem, I'd like to start us off. So essentially, to understand any modern day conflict, we have to look at its roots, right? We have to look at it in a historic retrospective. So essentially, well before the modern day state of Israel or the claimed state of Israel, Palestine was not really a state in itself. It had various amounts of changes of power from the Canaanites to the Egyptians, to the Zoroastrians, and all the way to like the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim empires. So up until 1918, the land was actually owned by the Ottoman Empire. So from 1517 to 1917, the Ottoman Empire ruled the state of Palestine. Under them, it wasn't really a Muslim dictatorship. It was essentially just a community-oriented group. But then there's been historical reports of discrimination against certain groups. But then essentially the Ottoman Empire did have supreme power over the entire region. Um, Till 1918, the British took over, and by 1922, they received administrative powers. So the League of Nations issued a British mandate, and the mandate essentially said that they would like Palestine to be a Jewish national homeland. This is essentially like the first time the world has bared witness to a Zionist rhetoric. Um, Immediately after the British, they made actually further commitments that Palestine should be a fully Jewish state. So this led up to the formation of Israel, and this is still much before the Nakba itself. So although the Zionism has been present since 1800s, in 1923 is when the mandate officially goes into effect. The Jewish Agency is established, and an influx of Jewish immigrants and land purchasers under the British Palestine Mandate start coming into Palestine. So this is when we start seeing a shift in demographics. We see Jews from all over the world coming into the state of Palestine to reclaim what they thought were their holy lands. Because one of the first historical groups to claim that land was the Jewish people, although most recently, for 200 plus years, it was under Muslim rule. So this is kind of when we can see the foreshadowing of conflict itself. So after that, there was a 6 month long strike in Palestine where the British responded by wounding and slaughtering 190 civilians, and 800 people were injured. So this is when we see that the world forces are actually aligning against the Palestinians, the natives of the land, which they recognize as natives of the land. Soon after that, the Zionist Party was founded, and the Jewish national homeland strengthened all over the world. People genuinely thought that the Jewish people deserved their own national homeland because of the fact that by now there was enough land purchasers and there was enough influx of Jewish refugees for them to have adequate claim to. So then there was the Arab Revolt of 1936 and 1939. This is when we see the severance of ties between Arab nations and Western allies. So right after that, these Arab areas were relocated for Jewish people. Arabs were kicked out into Jordan and other states. So this is when we're seeing a trend that carries on till the Nakba. So what was the Nakba? So following World War II, thousands of Jewish refugees were allowed into Palestine. The European Jewish refugees strive for a Jewish state. So this was the rhetoric amongst them that since Europe had become increasingly violent towards their kind, that they should have a national homeland of their own where they're safe. So under that pretense, they were allowed into Palestine. So May 15, 1948 was the official day of the Nakba, where almost 700,000 Palestinians, and reports claim way more, were wrongfully and forcefully evicted from their homes. And in Palestine, this day is mourned, but in Israel, this day is celebrated as it marks the final formation of their state. So that's just the opposing rhetorics that's present in the nation. So essentially, that was the Nakba. But then after the Nakba, something else happened as well. So Palestine and Israel lived on their own land under the state of Israel. However, Palestine was given three territories, which was the Gaza, the West Bank, and the occupied East Jerusalem. When I say occupied East Jerusalem, it's because East Jerusalem was given to them. However, in modern day, it was actually retaken by the Israeli government. Palestinians also live in cities and towns all over the country, but they do not have full rights as Israeli citizens. So, despite them living in Israeli territories, in the same region, in the same ideas, they're not granted full citizenship. So essentially, that is the fallout. That is the Nakba. There's other things that we skipped over, such as the 6 Day War, which was, as it says, the 6 Day War between like the Arab countries and the Jewish country, supported by the national agencies of America, Britain, a lot of European countries. So all the countries that recognized and helped form Israel had a war with a lot of Arab countries, which Israel won. And ever since then, they've been granted unprecedented access into Palestinian land and property. So that was the Nakba. That's the brief overview of history. So, yeah.
Thank you, Abrar. That was very in depth. Thank you so much. So some terms already just came into the mix, and I really want to establish some definitions before we get deeper into this. So, Abrar, you mentioned Zionism. Now, Zionism is really it's a nationalist ideology, it is very and it's very integrated into the government of the state of Israel, and kind of like how Abrar mentioned, it's the belief of having a full Jewish national state in the land of Palestine. And remember, Palestine was or is an already established country, so it's they're really trying to enforce a fully ethnically and religiously full Jewish state in an already established land. However, this is not to be confused with um, Zionism, and so other than that, so then we have anti-Zionism, and anti-Zionism is not to be confused with anti-Jewish or anti-Semitism. Because remember, anti-Zionism is the disapproval of this full Jewish state in the land of Palestine, whereas anti-Semitism is hate towards Jewish people. And I'd like to reiterate that we are not supporting hate towards any group of people, towards anyone. However, we are calling upon the criticism of Zionism because of how it has impacted Palestinians, and because that it is, immoral and it is illegal. So again, we just wanted to establish that anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Jewish hate are not the same thing. Another word that Abrar did mention was we didn't mention yet, but we will get there. But illegal occupation. Now, illegal occupation is essentially actually, how about this? Does anyone else here want to give us a definition as to what illegal occupation is?
So illegal occupation can be in terms of two ways, which is military occupation and social occupation. Military occupation is the most easiest one to define, which is essentially control by asserting power over a territory without claim or formal sovereignty or rule of that land. So basically, external forces coming into somebody else's property and taking it by force. Territory is considered occupied when it is actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. The occupation extends only to the territory where such authority has been established and can be exercised. And if we're in this context, Israel in 1967 became the occupying power in the Palestinian territories. So the world basically recognized some of the Palestinian territories to be illegally occupied, as internationally those are supposed to be sovereign lands ruled by Palestinian authorities. However, Palestinian authorities have yet been ceased, and the Israeli government has taken over those properties. So that is essentially what occupation is. It's taking over something else that you don't have sovereign or native rule to or right to rule. That is essentially what occupation is.
Thank you so much, Abrar. And now, speaking of the occupied territories and the Palestinian territories, they include Gaza, the West Bank, and occupied East Jerusalem. And again, we're saying occupied East Jerusalem because it's the correct terminology to describe it. And another word that I like to introduce is apartheid. Now, apartheid is a crime under international law and is considered a crime against humanity by the UN General Assembly. And what it is that it's basically describing the purpose of establishing or maintaining dominance and superiority by one racial group over another. So you're basically occupying a land or taking over that land to have some sort of superiority or dominance over one group over another. And by this definition, Israel is considered an apartheid state. So let's talk about the territories really quickly. So again, if you guys can jump in. So Gaza. So Gaza is a strip of land controlled by Hamas that is surrounded by Israel, but it's populated by Palestinians. And the Gaza blockade started in June of 2007 and is still ongoing. And the West Bank. Anyone want to start us off with what the West Bank is or what that entails?
So basically, it is a portion of land that is in east of Israel, and it is home to, I think, almost 3 million Palestinians. And Israel took control of this land in 1967, and they still have control over this land. And the Palestinian government and the Palestinian people that live in this land have little to no rights over it at all, and they have no rights to defend themselves in it at all.
Yep, exactly. So that's pretty much all of it. Yep, thank you so much.
So just to jump in here, it's a landlocked territory in the Mediterranean coast, so it makes it extremely hard to escape it via coastal regions. There's 230 internationally recognized Israeli settlements that are there that have been deemed illegal. And Israel actually gained occupation over this territory during the Six-Day War in 1967, and it was unilaterally annexed recently. So it's internationally recognized as a Israeli occupied territory.
Yep, exactly. Thank you. And lastly, East Jerusalem. So East Jerusalem was illegally occupied by Israel since 1967 and has been heavily annexed as well. And East Jerusalem is actually technically a part of the West Bank. So that is just your brief, really, really brief history. Again, I'm urging all of you who are listening to further your research because, again, we're really just trying to scratch the surface and give you guys just an intro to what has happened in Palestine and how this entire situation has accumulated, how it has come about. But now we'll get into the more recent events, which includes Sheikh Jarrah, Al-Aqsa, the Gaza, and the quote-unquote ceasefire, as well as Silvan, which is much more recent. So is there anyone that wants to start off with talking about what has happened in Sheikh Jarrah?
All right. So basically, Sheikh Jarrah is it's a mostly Palestinian neighborhood. It is located in East Jerusalem, and recently, or the event that happened recently was Israel had went and ordered evictions on the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, which then forced them out of their homes for Jewish settlers. Around May 2nd, the Jerusalem District Court ruled that 6 families had to leave their homes even though they had lived there for generations. Essentially, what was happening is that all these families, all these Palestinian families who had lived in Sheikh Jarrah for long, long time, as I said, for multiple generations, were being forced out for new was being forced out for new Jewish settlers.
Just quick add-on, but what happened in Sheikh Jarrah was almost like a spark in the whole event of what would lead to happening in Al-Aqsa and in Gaza, and that was kind of really like the starting point, and it all kind of crumbled from that point, and things just started spiraling down. But I can start talking about Al-Aqsa, and essentially what happened was Al-Aqsa is one of the holiest mosques in Islam, and it's very special to Muslims for obvious reasons. And on April 13th, which is the first day of Ramadan, Israeli forces entered Al-Aqsa and cut the loudspeakers, which are used for calls to prayer. And eventually what happened was the Israeli forces had forcefully entered Al-Aqsa and stopped prayers and had thrown tear gases and rubber bullets in at praying Muslims. And I saw Salma wanted to do this, or Abrar, whoever. You guys can continue.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Al-Aqsa is historically and religiously extremely important. But way before the Qibla was established, we were actually told to pray towards the Masjid Al-Aqsa. So the fact that Al-Aqsa is located in Jerusalem, which is also historically relevant and Islamically significant, is important as well because this event is something that's been going on in Greater Jerusalem and not just the Al-Aqsa region, where 300 people were injured in clashes between Palestinians and Israeli police. I don't like the word clashes necessarily because it was a unprecedented power from one side versus another side, which is the Palestinians. So it wasn't necessarily a clash. So it's important that we don't label it as such because it makes it seem that there's equal access to power and authority. Israeli police did issue a statement saying that thousands of Palestinians barricaded themselves in the building overnight ahead of the Jerusalem Day flag march. And the march by Israeli nationalists marked Israel's capture of East Jerusalem, and the organizers canceled the event after police turned the route after fears of further unrest. So on the holy month of Ramadan, where they're reflecting on everything else, they were attacked by a state-sanctioned attack by the Israeli government against them because they wanted to make way for an Israeli flag march, which is unethical because you're in the enemy's territory, you're in territory that was forcefully seized, and you're celebrating the access of power. And that march is not only a military dedicated event, it's something that a lot of people work on. It's a lot of it's a nationalist pride to stand. So to do that essentially on a day where it's like the last couple days of Ramadan, is something that internationally has been condemned, however, not by the appropriate party. So essentially, Al-Aqsa Masjid was one of the center points of the attack. Multiple injuries, hundreds of injuries, and extremely severe injuries. So that's really what sparked the civil unrest.
Yeah, and I also just want to emphasize that the attacks on Al-Aqsa Mosque have been going on for so many years, since the beginning of the illegal occupation, to the point that the Palestinians themselves have to keep rocks inside the mosque in order to protect themselves, and in order to defend the holy building, in case they get attacked, which is, it's so crazy to think about, when it's like you go to a mosque to like pray and to reflect on your religion and to reflect on your relationship with God, just for there to be a high chance that you might die there and you might get attacked by a whole military force that are going to come kill you. But in more recent events, when they did attack Al-Aqsa on May 7th, this led to a lot of protests, naturally, by Palestinians, specifically the youth. And then Hamas started attacking Israel back in defense, as to what they did to Al-Aqsa. And then this led to a lot of the events that end up happening in Gaza later.
Okay, so another thing is, just to understand the situation a bit better, we should label it in a certain way, because it's extremely important to understand what's essentially happening. Al-Aqsa was not an isolated incident. It is a colonialism, it is apartheid, it's a state-sanctioned violence. So it's important to understand essentially why this has been happening for the purpose, because Israel essentially functions as a state, uh, um, a ethnically cleansing agenda having genocidal state, right? So this was not an isolated incident. And once we cover Gaza, we'll go further in details about why the regime that Israel functions as is extremely unethical and immoral and has human consequences.
Okay, so I'm gonna start talking about what actually happened in Gaza. And fair warning, it can get pretty gruesome and a little uncomfortable for some people, because I am going to be talking about death and bombings and whatnot. But I just want to reiterate the fact that the Gaza population is almost entirely Palestinian, meaning any people that die in in Gaza, we are gonna assume were Palestinian. But as Salma said before, Hamas began launching missiles into Israel in retaliation of what had happened in Al-Aqsa. But other than Al-Aqsa, there were also um, protests that youth were doing, trying to sort of defend themselves. And the military were very violent against those and were quite literally attacking those youth protesters. And so this was Hamas's way of retaliating, and they indiscriminately bombed parts of Israel. And Israel took this as an opportunity to quite literally berate all of Gaza and essentially destroy buildings and houses and everything they could do in their path. I'm not going to speak on that too much, because then it becomes a little less objective, but you know, they said they were discriminate, and they said they had the right to defend themselves. But then what had happened was almost 58,000 Palestinians had to flee their homes from rocket fire, and 227 Palestinians were killed, including 64 children. Now that's a big number, and I want you to contrast this with the number of people that Hamas had killed at the time. So this statistic was from May 10th, and at that time, Palestinian rockets had killed 12 people in Israel, including 2 children. And although a life is a life and killing is wrong all the way across the board, but just the sheer contrast in numbers shows not only the difference in military power, the struggle in power, but also the difference in the way that the world is viewing them. Because if you were to look at any media, they would instantly support Israel and what they're doing. And I see Abrar, you want to jump in, so go ahead.
Yeah, great points for us. I want to further emphasize what he just said about the differences in power and the differences in the struggle for power. So since 2008, 5,590 Palestinians have been massacred in the state of Israel, either in their territory, in their occupied territories, either in places like Gaza, either in places like Sheikh Jarrah, or just in the broad daylight in the streets of Tel Aviv, in the streets of Jerusalem. So since 2008, 5,590 of them have been slaughtered, compared to a whopping 251 from Israel. And just from my tone, I hope you guys understand it's sarcastic. And I think the most violent episode of this entire regime was in 2018, where 31,558 Palestinians were injured, with a huge amounts of deaths as well. While in that same year, Hamas retaliated, which caused 131 injuries and no deaths in Israel. So this is just some statistics to get your mind to wrap around the fact that there's an unequal access to power and an unequal access to just authorizing that power, to going through military capabilities and functioning as a state-sanctioned oppression. So that's essentially what Gaza is. Gaza is a testament, an example of what's been going on for centuries, not centuries, sorry, what's been going on for generations.
And just to add a little more, the bombings that happened in Gaza lasted for around 11 days. And within those 11 days, Israel was bombing, like I said, buildings, but they were bombing buildings and houses, claiming that Hamas was hiding away in those buildings. And one of the most famous bombings that happened in that way was done to the Al Jazeera building. And if you don't know what Al Jazeera is a very respected and credited reporting outlet, I guess you could say. And I just want you to know, like, it's very it mirrors a group. I'm not gonna say what, but it's very similar to something. Anyways, but about 80% of the population of Gaza depends on international aid, like we mentioned before. But this is really important, as due to all the bombings and all of the displaced homes and the people that were at this point homeless, kids were homeless, families were homeless, old people were homeless. The stress on the Gazan aid was so extreme that a lot of people weren't getting water and food regularly. And this was further extreme. It was more extreme because of the Gaza block that was placed by Israel.
This is a little bit random, but just to give you guys an idea of what else the Israeli nation bombs and what they tend to destroy, it's not just neighborhoods that they want to claim. They are genuinely ethnically cleansing the Palestinian nation. Sometime in May, they bombed a refugee camp and killed 10 people, including 8 children. So they destroyed a full family. And in the reports after the bombing, they claimed that they thought that their aim was to kill off the people of Hamas, but it's literally a refugee camp with more than 80,000 people living homelessly in that refugee camp. So it's like, just to give you an idea of, like, they're not really aiming to kill, or they're not really aiming to just get land. They're aiming to fully kill off all Palestinian people.
Okay, yeah, it's really heartbreaking. I'm gonna jump into the ceasefire, or as we're calling it this quote unquote ceasefire, because not much has really happened. But in order to talk about the ceasefire, we have to look at it from a more international viewpoint and see how other countries impacted this decision. So first of all, I believe it was Egypt. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but Egypt was handing out aid to the Palestinian population, whether it be food or medical care. And then the world was putting a lot of pressure on the United States and Canada to make very clear-cut statements saying that they want Israel to stop bombing and essentially stop what they're doing. That didn't happen for a while. What actually happened was the United States was very clear in their support for Israel and their bombings on Palestine, and that they would, I believe the wordings was, they would support Israel in their right to defend themselves. Once again, that idea comes up of them defending themselves against a group with much less military power. the United States hands out about $3.8 billion to Israel yearly, and that's why Israel actually has one of the most advanced defense systems against rockets and whatever. And you might have heard of the Iron Dome. But eventually, Biden came out with a statement simply asking in a very non strict way, saying, "Hey, Israel, this ain't cool. Can you please stop?" And then, well, initially, Israel quite literally said no. But then, for more pressure from around the world and Israel supporters, they said, "Fine, we can work on something." And the ceasefire eventually happened, and it came about with the help of Egypt, America, and I believe Canada had some part in it, but not much. And yeah, something that's really important though I want to say is the United Nations multiple times had come together to decide on whether a ceasefire would happen, and multiple times America was the only group to say no, we are not going to help them have a ceasefire. I just want you to keep that in mind. And if anyone wants to jump in and add anything, please be my guest.
Yeah, so America never like will back an Palestinian narrative, but the fact that they can I forgot the exact word, but like they kept on denying like the UN's entry into Palestine. If anyone remembers that word, just please jump in. But they kept on like denying like the UN access or something like that.
They were
So
vetoing. They vetoed the
yeah,
decision.
yeah, exactly. They're vetoing the UN's petition and stuff. So America single-handedly supports Israel through military gains, through social gains, through just demographics as well. You know, America sends them. America and Israel have formal, economic and political ties. Where to the point where actually Jared Kush, who is like the son-in-law of Trump, actually has family ties with Netanyahu himself. So it's just one of those things. It's like there's a lot of social connection and there's a lot of political alliance, which is really in contrast because like if you guys look at the history of the place, like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iraq, Iran, before the formation of OPEC, America had extremely strong ties with them. But then after the OPEC regions decided to sever their ties with America due to unmatched agenda, and like inadequacy of their government because America kept on changing from Democrats to Republicans, America decided to find its own ally in Israel. So historically speaking, America funds and supports Israel because of political gain in the geographical region of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, so the Middle East and the Levant. However, socially, America funds Israel because of its ties to World War II. And there's been certain political views where it's like they're supporting the state of Israel because they don't want to be in the wrong side of history because America got involved in World War II extremely late, which caused the unremorseful killings of so many Jews, like the genocide against the Jewish people in Europe. So socially, America benefits of supporting Israel because Israel has managed to create this rhetoric that if you don't support Israel, if you don't support an independent state of Israel, independent homeland for the Jewish people, you're automatically anti-Semitic, sorry, and you're anti-Jewish. And those are labels that nobody should have to bear. Um, so essentially, the social narrative Israel has created aids it to go on with this unforgivable acts of violence against Palestinians and the ethnic cleansing against them, which Salman mentioned. Because if you guys look at the statistics, there's a disproportional target ratio for children and women versus military soldiers of Hamas, military soldiers of any other terrorist or quote unquote terrorist organizations they deem. So that's just something to keep in mind as well.
Exactly. Now we're gonna jump into something that's a bit more recent. That you guys may have been seeing in the news, may not be, but it's Silwan. Now Silwan is also in occupied East Jerusalem. Is another neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem, and essentially kind of the same situation as to what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah. Many families are being evicted from their homes. However, further, Israeli courts have also have ordered like ordered families to demolish their own homes. And so they're making them do so. And if they don't, then they have to pay a fine. So basically, families are being ordered to literally destroy their own homes. And if they don't, then they'll be fined if the authorities have to do so. And on top of that, a lot of and another case, I guess, is that a lot of these families who are a lot of families being told to be evicted from their homes so that the authority can demolish it to make room for some sort of Israeli, like some sort of like park or something. There's a specific word that I can't remember right now, but that's essentially what's been happening in Silwan. Very similar to what has been happening in Sheikh Jarrah with evictions. However, further, there's been like demolition orders as well as having families be evicted to make room for some sort of park, some sort of I guess attraction. Yes, a religious sort of theme park kind of thing, and also again to make room for Jewish settlers. So that's basically a really quick, very brief run through of what has been happening recently. So again, we talked about Sheikh Jarrah, we talked about Aqsa, Gaza, and the quote unquote ceasefire, and we talked about Silwan. Now the most, I think one of the most important parts is talking about the youth. So again, the question is, how does this relate to you? How has this affected you? What has youth done, and what can youth do? So who wants to start us off with our conversation about youth and Palestine?
Essentially, I want to start by talking about a little bit about censorship in terms of whether it's the media or the school. And all of us here, being a part of MSA and putting on a presentation about Palestine, have encountered censorship a lot. We have struggled with the words we were going to say, with the content we wanted to share with people, with the number of people we could share it with, and we had to find loopholes and back doors to really do what we wanted to do and kind of get it out the way we wanted to. And still, there was a lot of things that we were limited by and restricted by. But essentially, I just want to put out there that I believe, and I hope everyone here believes, and I'm sure they do, that censorship leads to propaganda in the way that if you can't hear both sides of any story, if you can't hear the Palestinian side of this issue, and this issue has been going on for much longer than I have lived. My parents have been hearing about it since they were kids, so like it's a very dense and long-term issue, and not being able to hear both sides of it is most definitely going to lead to propaganda. And if any of you are taking what is it, grade 10 history right now, you learn a lot about propaganda and the like harmful effects of it.
Yeah, so essentially the reason it relates back to the youth is because this generation has done more for like human society to not be silenced, essentially, right? Whether we look at like the political climate where young people are voting, are starting to vote more now, or we look at the environmental climate where notably Greta Thunberg really took the world by storm, and decided to get unparalleled access to like speaking rights, and it really went to these international conventions and made her voices heard. So the reason youth matters is because honestly, we're like, I think it's been said multiple times. I feel like we're desensitized to it, but we are the leaders of tomorrow. Look at it physically. Average lifespan's 80 years, and then soon after, the people in power, which are most of the time much, much, much older than the active demographic, they'll lose power, and then they'll go to the next generation and the next generation. That's the physical aspect, but the social aspect too. It's like we're the ones that are relentless. We are the ones that are fueling these charges. Look at like the civil rights back in the day. We were like the youth were really carrying it because everyone much older with established jobs and families were too scared to stand up. So the thing with the youth is we have unparalleled access to the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, and just the freedom of gathering, really. Like, so again, like going back on the censorship too, is because the reason this should matter to us is because we are a generation that hates being silenced. We hate being told what to do. And just from the MSA perspective, as a president, after countless hours of discussion, it was extremely evident that the student body was going to be censored in this topic. We were told to remove the entirety of history, which we mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. We were told to remove parts of geography, which we also mentioned in this presentation, this podcast. But most notably, we were told to remove the word ethnic cleansing. And that is something that we identified through statistics today. And that is something that internationally, a lot of amnesties and humanitarian councils have also recognized. But the fact that in an education facility, such as a high school, which you're supposed to think implements change, which you're supposed to think educates the student body, instead of educating the student body, we were whittled away from what we wanted to say, and we were given these extremely nuanced and two-sided words to replace them with. Even the position itself, even the presentation itself, was supposed to be Palestine 101. That's it. No, nothing underneath, nothing above it. Palestine 101. Get people to come in, learn about what's been going on in Palestine, care about the situation and ways to help. However, after 21 days of postponement, we were forced to implement a crucial change. We were forced to say it's a Palestinian perspective, which removes the entirety of the humanitarian aspect of it. Because once you single out just one demographic, it's easy to get people to not care anymore, because you're essentially saying that this conflict only works with this one group of people rather than it being a humanitarian issue. So this works. This is relevant to the youth because we don't like being silenced. But with this issue, whether it be the media or whether it just be me and my team, censorship is rampant. Ignorance of experience, ignorance of education, and ignorance of the freedom to learn is rampant. It's widespread. And the hypocrisy of the state and the government is also extremely notable. That is why the youth should care, because this is something that branches onto all aspects of life. Not only is it a humanitarian issue, it is an issue that most people aren't aware of. So it's also an issue of ignorance and inadequacy. And those are everything that shapes our future to what we don't want it to be. That is why the youth should care.
Yeah, kind of adding on and also echoing at the same time what Abrar was talking about. As the youth, our biggest power that we have is knowledge, is our knowledge and our ability to communicate it and to spread it. The generations before us, they may have learned a little bit about this, but they had no way of effective and efficient, you know, broadcasting and kind of sharing their knowledge to everyone else in the world. And I think what we have here is really special. We have social media, we have these different platforms that give us the ability to speak out on what's going on in our world. And I think it relates to the youth because we need to exploit this. This is really a blessing in disguise that we've been given and that we need to use so that we can expose what's going on in our world, and so we can show everyone in the world what's going on and how this is. By showing everyone else and by educating people, this is how we progress as a society. And so it's very important that we make sure we are still educating people and showing everyone all sides of the story and all perspectives. Because if a person is only fed one perspective of the story, that's how radicalization happens. That's how people become one sided, because they feel as if the other perspective is unnecessary to learn and is just plain in truth the wrong side. So it's definitely very important that, as Tabia mentioned in the beginning of this podcast, that we keep an open mind and an open heart.
100%, exactly. And adding on to this idea of youth and talking, we have to realize that, when it comes to issues like this, when it comes to Palestine or any other humanitarian issue, it's important that we keep talking and that we keep having these discussions, even if our higher authorities, even if, the adults don't want us to talk. Because like so many of you guys have mentioned before, we are the future. The fate of the world literally rests upon our shoulders. And if we don't talk about these issues as youth, as we are in our youth, times, who is gonna talk about it? We can't wait for anyone else. We have to start these conversations ourselves. As youth, as leaders in our own community, as people who have access to knowledge, who have access to resources to talk about these things. Because in Palestine, so many of the people who are in Palestine, of these Palestinians, they are being silenced. They don't have a voice. And it's a responsibility as youth for us to talk about these things, for us to bring forth the Palestinian narrative that has been ignored and silenced for decades, for generations. I'll pass on to Faraaz, who's been patiently waiting.
Um, I just wanted to add on to what Samir and Abrar were both saying. They were talking about like our access to things, and I think oftentimes we take for granted the access to information over all we have. Like, I can access like 100 encyclopedias on my phone within like a minute, and just having that kind of information is absolutely amazing. And honestly, while we have that kind of information, we also have to like recognize the fact that there is going to be a lot of just nonsense and garbage out there that we really need to filter through and work through on our own. Because if we don't, we're not really credible ourselves, right? So we need to work through that information. And other than that, like I can't remember who, but someone was talking about this. But adults are gonna silence us. That's just they're gonna look at us and say we don't know what we're talking about. They're gonna like old people are senile. Like you don't get much from that, right? So, but but it doesn't take a genius to recognize the fact that lives are being lost, and those are lives. Those are children's lives. Those are like families. Those are people that had their entire lives ahead of them, and who just simply like passed away because of a dumb conflict that isn't being resolved over like petty political land fighting, right? That's what it is in my opinion. And it's just the fact that like like I said, it doesn't take a genius to recognize that lives are being lost, and those are lives that should not be lost. And it's almost embarrassing that this like issue has been happening for almost, I don't even know how, can someone tell me how many years this has been happening?
I totally agree with Faraz. I think it's important to say that we need to back up all the information that we see as well. Like, you see a lot of posts posted on Instagram and you see a lot of threads made and things like that. But it's so important to whatever post you see to just go to the internet and find an article or two from credible sources that back that up, just so that you know what you're talking about and just so that you can ensure that you're kind of processing the correct and credible information and that you're passing it on to your followers, the most credible information that you possibly can find. That being said, a lot of you touched on the idea that adults tend to silence us just because like their generation was brought up that way in terms of like activism is not really something that's prominent in their generation. But I also think it's important to note that in our own generation, there's still like a big part of the population in our own generation that is also a part of the problem. Like I have a lot of friends that will use the excuses like oh, I'm not educated about the issue, or I can't relate to it. I'm not Muslim, I'm not Palestinian, I'm not Jewish. I'm nothing, none of those characteristics. So how can I speak about it? And that is almost as harmful as just being silent about the issue, because you're kind of categorizing it as if it's a religious issue or as if it's a cultural issue when it's just a humanitarian issue. And that's why every single human being needs to speak about it. And that's where the youth kind of plays in. And like Samir said, we have access to social media. We have access, like the fact that we can just wake up on a Monday morning and decide to post a line to our 500 followers and all of them are just going to see it. And that's just something that we have access to is an insane amount of privilege. And the fact that not everybody is using that and not everybody thinks that that is a powerful resource is insane to me, because you literally have the power to give any amount of information to a whole audience of people. And that is, if that's like not a powerful resource, then honestly, like I don't know what else is. And we just need to start using it as to its potential, because social media is so powerful, and whatever information we want to spread on it, we can spread on it. And that's where the youth voice comes in. So you have to keep spreading the correct information, and you have to keep educating yourself and educating the people around you.
Yeah, so when it comes to educating too, that's what I meant by hypocrisy, because like those that we appoint to positions of education and authority are the ones that make it their agenda to betray us and silence us. And it's also important that we look at credible sources, as all of you guys have mentioned. But what I really want to focus on is like the social narrative, right? It's like if you guys look at psychology as well, like the reason a lot of people won't speak up about this is because they're scared of social alienation. Either that, or when they say stuff like I'm not Muslim, I'm not Palestinian, I'm not Arab, I'm not Jewish, that is another means of self-preservation when they do not want to focus on the topic because they're worried that if they dive into a topic such as this, they'll get into murky waters, they'll start losing themselves, they'll lose their pre-made knowledges and stuff. So essentially what goes on is the fact that especially these societies, these Western societies that have led and helped the formation of Israel, have opted to the social alienation aspect for people. That is why you don't necessarily see people in the position of power ever speak up about this. We have so many celebrities, we have so many musicians, we have so many rappers, so many iconic figures, right? None of them will speak up about this because their careers are in jeopardy, because they fear for social alienation, as I'm mentioning multiple times. And that is the adverse effects of not speaking up for a long time. As for us asked, like, how long has this been happening? This has been happening for more than 200 years. Since the 1800s, they've had a Zionist rhetoric. Back then there was opposition because the Ottoman Empire ruled that region, so they were strongly opposing it. But ever since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, there has not been a single Islamic or Arab nation that have forcefully attempted to take Israel back. Because after the Six-Day War, it was evident that all the Western powers have sided with Israel. The Israeli passport is one of the most highly valued passports in the world, while just south of the just go east to the border in Iraq, and Iraq has the world's worst passport. This is all deliberate. This ruins the validity of other regions to even exist in that land. And if you don't support Israel, if you don't support Zionism, you are automatically labeled as anti-Jewish. And because of the atrocities committed in World War II, all of this is something nobody wants to have on their plate. So essentially, the psychological aspect of this issue is extremely big. When it comes to situations like the Uyghur genocide, the Rohingya crisis, it's extremely easy to just say, guys, there's this happening. This is the combatants. This is who's in the right. This is who's in the wrong. War is never black and white. There's always gray areas. But I'm just saying certain conflicts are much, much easier to digest than this conflict, because this conflict has the whole trifecta of bad things. It has the social alienation aspect, it has the psychological alienation aspect, it has the political alienation aspect. We live in a region that actively funds Israeli military. For me to even speak up, for us to gather here today as well, there could be animosity from other parties. There genuinely could. We don't know who's going to view this and in what light. But our goal as youth of tomorrow and the youth of the present is to educate people. Because if we don't do it, nobody else will. Because we have to set things up for the youth that's coming after us, the people that are following up on our footsteps. The reason it's extremely hard for us right now is because our predecessors, our parents' generation, they did not do enough for it to be a more black and white issue. Right now, it's all these grays, and Israeli narrative is the predominant one. That is why we have to focus on education and credibility, as a lot of you mentioned. So I know I've been talking, so I'm just gonna give it to Faraaz or whoever else was next.
I know we're about to wrap up and finish, so I'm just gonna say some last words. And we're all pretty young. Okay, we're all 15 to 18, or however old people are in this youth group. But it can be very overwhelming talking about something this deep and like old as like historically. And I just want everyone to remember that I understand that we live halfway across the world from Palestine and Israel, and our hands-on impact can be very minimal if you look at it from, the whole picture. But just having these conversations is really important. Posting about it is very important, and just talking about it in general is very important, because if we're talking about it when we're so young, imagine the fruitful and the amazing conversations and like the deep and meaningful ones we're going to have when we're older with people that are even more educated with us. And like, I bet you when you guys get to university, there's going to be professors that are going to have no problem talking about this, because guess what? They don't care. Professors literally could give less of a crap about what they talk about, because at the end of the day, they're going to get paid no matter what, because they know they're irreplaceable. So like, you can have these kinds of conversations in university and not be scared of being penalized or judged or like, chastised. So I just want you guys to remember that although like having these conversations right now might be difficult, continue having them and keep it in the back of your mind. Keep it present, right? Because eventually you're gonna become politicians and lawyers and lawmakers, and we are the people that are going to be making policies that are either going to help or make things worse for Palestinians. And I understand that if after listening to this, some people still are on the side of Israel or are supporting Palestine after listening to this. That's not for me to judge. I'm obviously gonna disagree with you if you do support Israel. But once again, like that's not for me, that's not my place, right? Like I don't know any of you guys and I don't know what you believe in, but we understand that lives are being lost at the end of the day. And once again, those are lives that should not be lost. And those are lives that should be protected. No matter how you look at it, lives are lives and they should be living, right? But yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Faraaz, for that final piece. As Faraaz did mention, we unfortunately are going to have to end. And however, I just want to reiterate the fact that just because, this podcast, we're ending our conversation here, doesn't mean the entire conversation about Palestine is to end. We will not stop having these conversations until Palestine is absolutely free, until the children, the citizens, the Palestinians are free. And so we'll wrap up things here. Once again, I'd like to thank Abrar, Faraaz, Salma, and Samir for joining us today and to have this important discussion. And again, just as a reminder, make sure to check us out on social media, whether that be Instagram, Facebook, Discord, or YouTube. We'll be there at JOS Youth, Just Our Stories. And if you want to learn more about today's topic, we urge you to continue to do your research and stay informed. I hope you all stay well, and I hope we all continue to have important and meaningful discussions. This has been JOS, Just Our Stories. We'll catch y'all later.